Hello, folks, and welcome to The Farm, a podcast dedicated to culture, parapolitics, and high weirdness in all its many forms. This is your host, Recluse, aka Stephen Snyder, the longtime curator of the Visa blog and author of A Special Relationship, Trump, Epstein, and the Secret History of the Anglo-American Establishment. If you like what you hear here today, be sure to check me out at visaview.blogspot.com and procure a copy of that book and my other works at the Farm's official store, which is at thefarmpodcast.store. That is the Farm Podcast, all one word, .store. And please consider signing up for the Farm's Patreon. You get 2 additional full-length shows per month. That's between 3 and 4 hours of bonus material with exclusive guests and content. All right, I've got a pair of repeating guests for today's episode of the Farm. The first one up for consideration is the founder of the Coalition Against Voter Disenfranchisement and Election Fraud. He is also the curator of the excellent website for it, cavdev.org. And he is presently investigating the mysteries of John Benet Ramsey's death, Ted Bundy, and the infamous Henry Lee Lucas case. He is George of CavDev. George, thank you so much for dropping by again today, sir.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great to be back on.
Absolutely. And also joining us tonight is the ultimate repeater. He is John Brisson of We've Read the Documents. John, thank you so much for joining us, sir. I don't even know why I'm doing introductions for you at this point, quite frankly.
I have no idea why you are doing that either, Recluse, but I'm definitely welcome to be back here on the farm. Glad to be back here. And of course, this is the Research Dream Team right here. Me, George from CavDev.org, and Recluse, aka Stephen Snyder from Vise Up. And we're gonna bring some interesting information out there for y'all tonight. So
you guys are going to hear so many obscure facts. It is going to make your heads blow up, I swear. So on that note, for today's show, we are going to return to the mysterious state of Ohio and consider some of the intrigues there. Now, I know Ohio doesn't sound that sexy, kids, but trust me, a lot of weird shit goes on there. Last fall, I had Chris Knowles and the Pennyroyal crew on here to discuss the matter a bit. Among other things, the Pennyroyal guys gave us a rundown of the mysterious Bait Cabal, which was loosely centered around Cincinnati during the late 1970s. This group was probably the largest collection of followers of Kenneth Grant outside of New York City at the time. Grant was, of course, one of the rivals for the succession rights to Aleister Crowley and the OTO, though he eventually did his own thing with the Typhonian Lodge and so forth. Now, during the time the OTO in America was dominated by Grady McMurtry, it was known as the so-called Caliphate, and it was based out of California. Now, Grady had a bit of an axe to grind with Kenneth Grant, and as such, his work didn't receive very much recognition in the States during the 1970s. That is Kenneth Grant, so to say, when he first began to publish. Now, the major exception was NYC, where his teachings caught on with those centered around the infamous Warlock Shop. A young Peter Levenda first discovered Grant in such circles, allegedly. The Bait Cabal would later embrace Grant as well and forge links with the cultists in the New York City area, including Peter Levenda himself. The Bait Cabal was hardly the only esoteric outfit active in Ohio during this time either, kids. Good old Colonel Michael Aquino was stationed in Louisville, Kentucky during the mid-1970s, and he spread quote-unquote grottos of the Church of Satan around the surrounding area, including Ohio, which he frequently lectured at. Also active in Ohio during the mid-1970s was a curious character known as John Todd. Now, Todd became a darling of Christian fundamentalists during the 1970s and still exerts an enormous influence on the narratives concerning satanic pedophilia networks and conspiratainment to this day. For those of you unaware, Todd claimed to have been raised as a witch by his mother and is part of a line of druids who were in cahoots with the Illuminati or some such shit. He developed an elaborate hierarchy centered around the Illuminati and the Council of 13 and involved all of the usual suspects such as the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, and so on and so forth. The plan was to destroy Christianity and to implement one world government, because of course it was. This is interesting in light of the fact that Todd bounced back and forth between Christian fundamentalism and occultism for much of his life. During his time in Ohio, he was especially occulty. There he opened a magic shop called the Witch's Cauldron in Dayton. This was also a hot spot for the Church of Satan as well, and it was also during this time that Todd received his first conviction involving sex with minors. He would later be convicted of incest and rape, eventually dying in prison in 2007. That was the great John Todd, ladies and gentlemen. But in Ohio, Todd was just one of the boys. In this podcast, we're going to explore why. Now, to frame this episode, we're going to use a largely forgotten incident from the late 1990s. It involved anthrax, white supremacists, and one especially mysterious institution. So, let's get going. All right, George, to start off with, why don't you give us a rundown of the incident I'm alluding to? When did the arrests occur and what were the allegations?
Sure. So in late February of the year 1998, there was, like you say, a largely forgotten story. It was pretty prominent for a couple days, and then it was very quickly pretty much brushed under the rug and not really talked about anymore. But on February 19th, 1998, two men were arrested at a microbiology lab in Nevada, and they were both accused of trying to manufacture weapons-grade anthrax. The men were Larry Wayne Harris of Lancaster, Ohio, who had a microbiology degree and was also a white supremacist. And the other was a locally prominent businessman in Nevada named William Job Leavitt Jr. That's last name spelled Leavitt. So this odd couple, seemingly very much apart from each other. You have a prominent, well-respected pillar of the community and then a white supremacist, but both of them were seemingly unified in this alleged plot to manufacture this weapons-grade anthrax. And when it started, the FBI came down hard on them, arrested them, seized their biological materials for inspection. Interestingly enough, the materials that were seized were actually sent to none other than Fort Detrick in Maryland, one of the military's top biowarfare research labs. But within a couple days, the story pretty much began to reverse itself. It was quickly asserted that the anthrax that they had was actually just vaccine anthrax. It was not weapons grade, and that they were purportedly just studying it for legitimate biological research, medical research, and that the informant against them was supposedly jaded, had ulterior motives, and basically lied to the FBI. And then they were pretty promptly cleared in all allegations of actually having nefarious intent. And then the story pretty much just vanished, and no one's really heard about it or talked about it since. Although there are definitely some indications to the contrary, that there was more to it than the media and FBI ultimately concluded.
Now, George, do we have any idea who this mysterious informant was?
Yeah, we do. His name is Ronald G. Rockwell, who's certainly a curious figure involved in all sorts of esoteric types of businesses, purported miracle cures and all of that, which is also true of William Job Leavitt and some of the people in his orbit as well, who we'll get to later. And, it certainly is difficult to assess the relative credibility of these individuals, and, which is why, it's important to be somewhat balanced when discussing this case. But there are definite indications that William Job Leavitt was very much up to no good. And of course, even more blatant indications that Larry Wayne Harris, an overtly acknowledged white supremacist in the Aryan nations, was also up to no good, and that their claims of only being interested in doing research are often contradicted by other pertinent facts about their lives. So, although it would certainly be fruitful if Rockwell is still around to get his side of the story and see if he sticks by it, but certainly this is an interesting coalescence of individuals, if nothing else. Even if regardless of Rockwell's particular credibility in this case, there are certainly indications in the past of these two men that they were involved in very curious activities and circles.
All right, so let's look at these two individuals a little more closely. So first up, let's go over this Mr. Larry Wayne Harris. What are some more of the details about this guy, George?
Yeah, so Larry Wayne Harris was a graduate of Ohio State University, graduate in microbiology, and around that same time, he was also getting involved in the whole Christian identity movement. He was ultimately ascended to the point of being a lieutenant colonel in the Aryan nations, and his interest in biowarfare as a major major thing of interest really came about, according to him anyway, when he had an encounter with an Iraqi woman at Ohio State University. And this Iraqi woman purportedly told him that there was a big biowarfare effort coming from Iraq, that they were supposedly sending a bunch of Iraqi women who would be smuggling in vials of biological agents in their body cavities to pretty much weaponize and use against the United States. And so, according to Harris, he began to, began to get very involved in bio warfare, defense research, trying to figure out how to defend against these biological agents. Yet, at the same time, there are very clear indications that the people he was with and he himself were actually involved in causing bioterror rather than eliminating it. At one point, he gave an interview to the U.S. News and World Report, basically was saying that if his friends, which very clearly, very likely refers to the Aryan nations and the other Christian identity groups that he was part of, if his friends were provoked, that they would strike against government officials using biochemical weapons. And he also, at one point in basically in 1997, pretty much told an informant that he planned to make a sort of glass globe, fill it with bubonic plague, and stick it in the New York City subway so that a train would run into it and smash it up and basically spread it and murder hundreds of thousands of people. So he made many statements indicating that he and his white supremacist circle were actually interested in the weaponization of pathogens like bubonic plague and anthrax. In 1995, he actually was arrested for obtaining multiple freeze-dried vials of bubonic plague under false pretenses. Curiously enough, he passed himself off as a CIA agent in doing so, and he obtained this, but he was convicted and received a brief sentence. But he ultimately claimed that this was just for legitimate defensive research, and he pretty much was got a slap on the wrist and was back out on the streets within a year at most. So Larry Wayne Harris is a very very shadowy figure. He would claim that he was interested in protecting people from biological warfare, yet he gave many indications that he was actually a violent individual. When he was arrested in that 1995 incident, the arresting authorities found all sorts, basically a mini arsenal, blasting caps, hand grenade triggers, sort of indications that he was very much involved with a violent element of these groups. And another sort of curious thing is that actually the day before his arrest, he gave an interview on this sort of Patriot Movement affiliated channel to none other than the infamous Ted Gunderson, former FBI special agent in charge of
Really?
Los Angeles.
Gunderson, huh?
Yeah, it is very interesting. He told his whole story about how, meeting this Iraqi woman got him into the whole biowarfare thing from,
And he was telling Gunderson this is what you're saying?
yeah, a day before he got arrested. And, interestingly, not even clear that why the timing would have been so close if he was tipped off in some way. But it's very interesting.
Do you happen to know when this or where this interview was conducted? Because I think Gunderson had been kind of hanging out around Las Vegas during this era, like the mid 90s, with Robert Booth Nichols of the Promise scandal. Sherry Seymour documents this a bit in The Last Circle, recounts meetings with both men at the time in the Vegas area. So yeah, that's really interesting, since it seems like Vegas was also a significant location for the incident that you're getting into here.
Yeah, it was the KK. Let me see. Yeah, it was KKJK TV. I believe that was a Nebraska station. I'd have to go back and check that. And of course, Gunderson did have many ties to Nebraska as well. Going to the University of Nebraska and being close to people like John DeCamp and Ed Weaver of the Nebraska Leadership Conference. But yeah,
this was just a little after Franklin, I believe, was kind of dying down, right?
Yeah. I mean, about I guess a decade later, late or early 1998. But yeah, the association with all of these Christian identity people, and then in fact giving an interview to Ted Gunderson where he tries to pass off his interest in biowarfare as being solely defensive, even though that's very much unlikely based on all the other aspects of him. Certainly,
Did you listen to this interview?
No, I don't know if this interview was available anywhere. It was
Okay. I
talked about in.
was just curious if it was like a puff piece or something to that effect that Gunderson was doing for him.
Yeah, it would be very interesting to find it. But yeah, it was unfortunately just only talked about in some of these news articles. And a lot of the things about Harris, that it does seem that his giving an interview on that program was sort of a way of, I guess, building a defense, building an alibi for himself, of why he kept turning up in close association with all of these biological agents time and again. For example, he was supposedly writing this book called Bacteriological Warfare, a Major Threat to North America, which he claimed was a defensive book, but it gives very detailed instructions in the book about how to make uh, weapons grade biological agents. And it was even, considered, a lot of people described it as a how-to manual for bioterrorism. So it is certainly interesting to see him in the orbit of the Aryan nations, to see him in the orbit of Ted Gunderson, and to be claiming that his interest in all of this started purely as a reaction to this Middle Eastern woman, even though, Ohio State University, as we'll get into later, has a number of interesting connections of its own and other ties into potential intelligence connected biowarfare programs.
Yeah, it is something. I'm going to go a little off script here for a second because there's a question I've been dying to ask you about all of this. So, obviously, I believe 2 or 3 years later, we have the big anthrax scare, in 2001, shortly after 9/11. Uh, as I'm sure you are aware, one of the major suspects in all of this was a certain Stephen Hatfield. He's a very interesting guy. He was an American, a scientist who had a certain specialty, I believe, in anthrax, though he had also done time as a Green Beret. During the late 1970s, he had ended up in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and then after apartheid had fallen there, he had migrated down to South Africa, where he was active until apartheid ended there in 1994 when he finally made his way back to the States. Hatfield, there's always been a lot of speculation that he was possibly involved in some of these white supremacist circles. There were a lot of rumors about, bioweapons and that kind of thing being smuggled out of South Africa during that whole era in the mid 90s as apartheid was coming to an end. Gotta ask, it seems like, they might have ran in the same circles.
Yeah, it does very much sound like that. And I will say, although I have yet to undertake any sort of detailed examination of the 2001 attacks, I do certainly suspect that it was a larger, intelligence operation. And Hatfield does come across as a very interesting suspect for all the reasons that you say. And the way that it proceeded is certainly interesting, in that it was as if his reputation was allowed to be destroyed temporarily in exchange for this, $1 million payout, or that they ran up against. Accidentally, the investigation got too close, got too close to the truth, and then ultimately had to be very strongly walked back. Hatfield was, he was colleagues with none other than Jerome Hauer, who was a pretty well-known figure in 9/11 research circles, being part of the New York Office of Emergency Management under Mayor Rudy Giuliani at the time. And the Hauer at one point was interviewed by 9/11 researcher Sandra Hicks and pretty much asked, do you think Stephen Hatfield was innocent? And Hauer was somewhat interestingly equivocal on how much he was willing to uh, say about Hatfield's innocence. He was trying to say, I think he's very passionate. I don't think he's a murderer. But then when he was pressed by Sandra Hicks for any sort of definitive statement, he really wouldn't give one. And that came across very curious to Sandra Hicks. And of course, pointing out that that Hatfield was involved with these white supremacist governments in Africa. I think other than South Africa, I believe Rhodesia was where he operated for some time as well. And of course, there were
There's
many
also the
allegations.
major anthrax use of anthrax in Rhodesia during the final years too. In fact, I didn't they have like one of the largest anthrax outbreaks in the world in Rhodesia, like around 78 or 79, if I remember correctly.
I'm not sure, but that may well be the case. It wouldn't surprise me at all. I think especially during that time period when these sort of apartheid style governments were more active. I think the use of bioterrorism against these
Mm-hmm.
so-called
Yes.
undesirables was sadly very very common. And
Yeah, it's
yeah,
important to remember that, yeah, there was a lot of CBW, chemical and biological warfare research that was being done by Rhodesia and South Africa. I can't remember the Rhodesian program off the top of my head, but the South African one was Project Coast. And there was certainly a lot of interesting things that came out of that. Another big thing that was popular was the use of MDMA, more commonly known as ecstasy or Molly, and ketamine as crowd control drugs. That was something they experimented with. So yeah, that's kind of another interesting, thing that happened after apartheid ended too. The sort of flow of MDMA that mysteriously sort of started to go out of South Africa into the West. So yeah, it was a heady time, to put it mildly.
yeah, and what you say about Hatfill and Larry Wayne Harris before appearing to run in similar circles, it does sound like that. And the way that the biological warfare and especially with apparent intelligence connections and the white supremacist groups overlap is a curious pattern that shows up again and again in this line of work. I think at a certain level it is hard to consider it just coincidental. It is a very clear pattern here.
Because if I'm not mistaken, that was a major concern in the 90s, right? That some of these white supremacist groups would try to launch some kind of CBW attack, right?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
All right. Well, I don't want to get us too far sidetracked here. So, all right. So let's get to the more interesting of the two suspects for the Las Vegas incident we have strayed from. This is William Jove Levitt. The guy had a very interesting background. So first off, George, tell us about this guy's religion. It's interesting.
Yeah, he was. He was a local, Mormon bishop, and also, had a number of these, prominent community connections. So, we certainly do see the Mormon church aspect come up a lot in various lines of inquiry. You can see associations, for example, with the Mexican drug cartels and with Nexium recently, such with the LeBaron family. You see them appear in the Ted Bundy case as well. Ted Bundy at one point married into a family with basically a prominent Mormon family with a doctor in Ogden. So certainly the Mormon Church has a close association to a number of these curious operations. And William John Leavitt was in there. He was a bishop, and
Yeah, he
beyond
was
that,
part of the mainline LDS, right? He wasn't one of the
yeah,
fundamentalist groups.
yeah. From everything I can tell, it was just standard LDS.
Okay, okay. Just wanted to make sure he wasn't a polygamist, though he probably supported it in private, as many of them do.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, the appearance that he had was just a standard, fairly conservative seeming pillar of the community. He, was owned fire protection businesses in his hometown of Logandale. He was part of the town board, president of the Rotary Club. He was taken foster children. So, was basically ticked all the boxes for, really, standard all around, great guy who everyone seemed to respect, which of course does raise a question of why he's hanging out with this apparent white supremacist dirtbag, but we'll get into that in a bit. I would say also his family background is, I guess, somewhat interesting. His mother and father met on a military base in California, and then his father was pretty much very quickly after that sent to Harvard Business School at the behest of the military, which, at least in my opinion and opinion of some of my fellow researchers, is a pretty rare move for the military, to want to send you to school to get, more educated in the middle of all that, unless you're being prepped for some kind of more high level or even intelligence related mission, which is interesting to me. But then after that, his father, William Job Leavitt Sr., would go on to serve at various locales: the Pentagon, the Panama Canal Zone, Randolph Air Force Base in Texas, and also Nellis Air Force Base near Las Vegas. Nellis being close to the infamous Area 51, and also having a couple of other interesting people who hailed from it, such as the father of the Jewish, community center shooter Buford Furrow down in the Los Angeles area. The father of Buford Furrow, who supposedly had retired from the military, but still had a Pentagon email indicating that he worked for the National Security Council, which is rather strange. And Buford Furrow himself, the shooter, worked for a couple of defense contractors in the Seattle area, like Northrop Grumman and Boeing. And curiously, also Buford Furrow bought weapons from the same gun shop in Tacoma, Washington, Bullseye, that had supplied weapons to the DC snipers a bunch of years later. So very interesting connections with the family of William J. Leavitt, but don't want to digress too much. Anyway, his mother and father ran a local realty company, and then after the death of his father, his mother stayed in the industry and kept working, and she even ascended to the local board of realtors and was very influential in making standards for the industry that apparently exist around the country nowadays. But so anyway, he came from.
Ideal if they had any family connections to like the Fugels, or I think the Huntsmen actually also own quite a bit of real estate around there too, even though they're primarily associated with chemical research and so forth.
Not that I was able to find, but there's not much about their family that can be found, or not much about William Job Leavitt at all that can really be found. So
well, the real estate connection, I mean, is really interesting. I mean, obviously, there's the organized crime element of that, especially when you're right there next to Nevada, and Las Vegas is only about a day's drive away, I believe.
Yeah.
And then also there's well, there's a lot of interesting theories about there, specifically about what might have been involved in real estate in Utah and some of the more exotic experiments.
Right. And it's definitely, I mean, real estate, especially, if you think back to the Son of Sam case, I mean, the so-called kingpin of the cult there was known as Mr. Real Estate, was a person who was very much involved in that. And of course, real estate has, like you say, can have a good overlap with organized crime, can be used for money laundering, has a close association with the banks that are involved in these unsavory things. And as we'll see later about William J. Leavitt, he later was involved in some unsavory financial schemes a couple years after the whole anthrax scandal. But in the meantime, he, beyond his official business of fire protection, he also had more sort of basically a side hobby, or very eclectic interests in medical research, more or less. He was a microbiology enthusiast at the very least. I don't know if he ever got a real degree in it, but he certainly was very interested in it. He owned a number of microbiology labs in Nevada and also Germany, interestingly enough, and was basically had all these various ventures that were supposed to help, with, for example, curing cancer or getting rid of pathogens in interesting ways. Like one business that he was in, was basically like taking blood out of people, treating it with ozone, and then pumping it back into people to kill pathogens. He was involved in some sort of irradiation stuff to cure cancer. He had all of these interesting side businesses that were related to this whole medical research thing, and that was ultimately the grounds for his later defensive claim to say, I was just doing medical research with this anthrax, and I got involved with this guy Ronald Rockwell, and he was supposed to deliver some important component, and then he never delivered. Instead, he turned us into the FBI. And so certainly he has this sort of plausible deniability type of cover for what he was doing as legitimate medical research. But of course, as we described with Larry Wayne Harris, Harris was almost certainly and had untoward intentions with his use of these biological samples. He would even made overt statements indicating that he and his cohort were interested in bioterrorism. And then the real question that really dogs me, and I think should dog anyone who looks at the case, is why someone like William J. Leavitt, who would at the time have appeared to have no real skeletons in his closet, he might have been somewhat of an eccentric guy, but didn't have any overt record of anything nefarious. Why would he be teaming up with someone like Harris, who had a felony record for lying to acquire this bubonic plague toxin, who was a white supremacist, who talked about wanting to interest in committing these bioterror attacks? How did they come in contact? And supposedly they just met at some scientific convention in late 1997, a couple months before this whole thing went down. There's no real detail available on what type of convention it was or what drew them to each other. But a couple months after their first meeting, they're supposedly working together on this venture, which was, the claim is that they were getting this vaccine grade anthrax, not weapons grade anthrax, to have it be a cure, to try and make a system that would cure, basically would kill kill anthrax. But again, that's the claim. They were ultimately exonerated, but like I said, remember that the testing of the samples, according to these news articles from the time, took place in none other than Fort Detrick, the U.S. military's sort of chief biowarfare investigation location. So there's already
Fort
some.
Detrick also plays a large role in the 2001 anthrax incident as well. It was the what was it? The U.S. Gosh, I can't remember the name of the lab that's based out of there, but yeah, there was a lot that went into that with the 2001 incident as well.
Yeah, I know that in pretty early on in the 2001 incident, they basically found that the anthrax that was there had to have come from a U.S. military installation. There's really no other way that it could have just been naturally manufactured by some amateur. And ultimately, they did even try to pin it on this other guy, Bruce Ivans. But there are definitely questions about his. Yeah, Bruce Ivans, who worked at Fort Detrick, but there's various questions that persist to this day about whether the case against Bruce Ivans was legitimate, and even, there are some of the articles about mentioning his like psychological state at the time even raised questions, in my opinion, about whether he was under some kind of mental manipulation in line with the MK Ultra programs that these intelligence services would do. But of course, like I said, I would be very interested in doing a much more thorough dive into the 2001 anthrax attacks, but certainly this association with Fort Detrick is a curious one. And the claim by Leavitt and by Harris that they were only doing defensive biowarfare research pretty much matches the same excuse making that you would hear from the U.S. government, that they only study this stuff so they can know how to protect against it. And I mean, even the recent stuff coming out with the whole gain of function research with regards to COVID, it's always framed as, well, we have to do this research so we can protect against it. But what's very convenient is that all the same stuff that you have to do to defend against it are exactly what you have to do in order to actually produce it and weaponize it. And I think it would be very naive to think that the U.S. government is not interested in weaponizing it, these biological agents of terror, just as it would be very naive to think that white supremacist groups like the Aryan Nations would not be interested in weaponizing it. And in this case, you have pretty curious indications that both of these groups show up, and that both of them, thread their way through these two men of Harris and Leavitt. Now, in any case, they were ultimately cleared, and it is important for the record to reflect that it is very possible that this incident could have even been overblown. Of course, even if it was, it certainly exposed some the other strange connections of these people. That there is very little doubt that Harris was interested in bioterror, even if this one incident was overblown, and there is no definitive evidence that it is, given the suspect provenance of where the case clearance actually came from at Fort Detrick. There is these two men in general, and how they came to be associated with each other is just honestly too bizarre to ignore. And a couple years later, William Job Leavitt would once again find himself in the news. Not a very prominent story at all, but he was one of, I think, 8 defendants in this insurance scam in Utah that was a $1.6 trillion supposed insurance company that was particularly luring in members of the LDS Church, of all things, trying to get them to invest in it, supposedly, to their benefit. But of course, it was really a massive financial swindle. And William Job Leavitt, he was one of many defendants who was involved in this whole scheme. So you would find only like 5 years later that he was certainly involved in some unsavory activities, that this image of him just being a standard, upright businessman is not quite true, and raises even more questions about whether his denials and whether his association with the figure as overtly unsavory as Larry Wayne Harris was really just, a unfortunate mistake on his part, or something more intentional about his personality and what he was involved in.
Yeah, it is certainly quite fascinating. But there's possibly nothing quite as fascinating about Mr. Levitt as one particular business venture that he was involved with. George, why don't you tell us about that now?
Yeah, certainly. It was honestly stunning to me as well. one of the, like I said, he was involved in a number of these sort of esoteric medical research ventures and other sort of companies like that. And it just so happens that, and this is mentioned directly in the news articles, that he was listed in some corporate records in a couple of DC area businesses, one of them being none other than the Mankind Research Foundation. And the Mankind Research Foundation, which was formerly known as Mankind Research Unlimited, run by the somewhat infamous Dr. Carl Schleicher, is certainly something that has been discussed before. We discussed it before in our previous episode about the White Eagle Underground briefly. And of course, our friend here, John Brisson, knows a lot about it, including its connection to the Finders case. And yeah, Carl Schleicher was a partner of sorts with William Babb Levitt. They were involved together in a couple of strange projects, like this one sort of chemical project to build a sealant to protect against radon gas. They were also involved together in some real estate ventures. They had almost collaborated on the purchase of a hotel in Palm Springs, California, and trying to turn it into a drug rehab facility. So these two men, Levitt and Schleicher, were connected with each other, involved in each other's business ventures. And Schleicher was even quoted as saying, calling Levitt a very religious guy, calling him honorable, but supposedly, at least, they parted ways in 1997 for unclear reasons. But in any case, they certainly were associated for at least a couple years, because Levitt had actually been at the level of vice president of the Mankind Research Foundation, so he was pretty high up there as it stands. And that connection to Schleicher really opens the door in a very clear way that we haven't seen yet. There have been hints of it in the background I've given so far, but this is perhaps the clearest example of the intelligence agency connection to these individuals.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And now we are going to go a little bit more deeper into Mankind Research Unlimited. Now, John Boy, you have spent a fair amount of time looking at this outfit. So first off, why don't you give the kids at home a little bit more of an in-depth rundown of it? What was its stated purpose?
Yeah, so Mankind Research Unlimited was founded by Carl Schleicher. Carl Schleicher, give a little bit of background of his history. He graduated with honors to the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland in 1951 with a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. Schleicher was an intelligence officer for the United States Navy for 10 years and obtained the rank of lieutenant commander and assigned posts to both Germany and Turkey. Schleicher would later receive a master's degree in political economics from the University of Cologne in Germany in 1962. Carl Schleicher spoke 6 languages and was an interpreter for former United States President Dwight Eisenhower and former United States Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. Schleicher would later work as a research and development engineer for Marine Corps Development Center in Quantico, Virginia. And of course, Recluse, you and I have seen documents and research that it appeared that Mankind Research Unlimited, which was founded in the late 1960s, and during the 1970s had received millions of dollars of financing from the United States Navy and the Central Intelligence Agency. Actually, American author Alan J. Weberman, who was threatened to be sued by Carl Schleicher, but never happened, for his article in Covert Action in 1980 covering Schleicher and Mankind Research Unlimited, had reported that, of course, we've actually seen the documents that had that alluded to that, and Carl Schleicher's statement, of course, that they had never received any funding from the United States military. But however, as I have stated, that Carl Schleicher himself was a Navy intelligence officer for the United States Navy. So it's very likely, of him obtaining the rank of lieutenant commander, that he, let's just say, probably had a foot in the door with the Navy. So the stated purpose for Mankind Research Unlimited is that Mankind Research Unlimited was organized to collect, study, develop, and apply extensive and proliferating data on what may be called the frontiers of science. This data has come into being a result of cross-fertilization of various scientific fields, which long had little or no direct contact with one another, and the re-examination of research areas that were previously ignored by academia as heterodox. This orthodoxy of thought was also shared by many applied scientists in both industry and government. Consequently, the probability of achieving technological and scientific breakthroughs by the use of innovative ideas and concepts, however imaginative or esoteric they may be, had gradually diminished to the point where in certain critical areas, the United States is falling behind existing technological state of art in other countries of the world, notably those in Eastern and Western Europe. So remember, during this time period, there was kind of like a Cold War of arms and research, supposedly between the United States of America and the USSR. So that was kind of what Mankind Research Unlimited was played to when, we find out they were involved with Ingo Swann, and they were involved with Stefan D. Poseny, which I'll talk more about Stefan D. Poseny in a minute. And Christopher Bird, they were involved a lot in psychotronic warfare type research that you would normally see, projects like MK Ultra and MK Often, and what later was documented in the book The Men That Stare at Goats. I can't remember the guy's name. He was Alex Jones's buddy, Ronson. John Ronson had wrote the book of The Man That Stare at Goats. It kind of plays it off to the side that the military, wasn't really taking seriously their research for the Earth Battalion as far as kind of like a remote viewing and psychotronic warfare. It's not really real, it happened, but it's not really much of a thing. But Mankind Research Unlimited, as a whole collective group, as an organization, claims that they were involved a lot in the research and, with evolving all of those things that the Earth Battalion later at Fort Bragg would study. And so they kind of mention it in this stated mission statement of Mankind Research Unlimited. I guess with all the worded dialogue that's in there, that's pretty much what they're talking about. They supposedly did. Mankind Research Unlimited hopes to reverse this trend and serve as both a catalyst and an originator of new and creative ideas to stimulate research and technology applications in areas beneficial to mankind. Based on our experiences in systems, concept development, and technological forecasting, we feel this objective can be optimally attained through application of system engineering principles to direct, coordinate, and govern the activities and creative efforts of our multidisciplinary teams of scientists and experimenters. So, of course, Mankind Research Unlimited boasts, Carl Schleisler would say that he was continuing the pedophile and the widely known psychiatrist Wilhelm Reich's research, of course, dealing with orgone therapy and weather control and among other things. So I don't know why you would look to Wilhelm Reich as being a good person to model your business practices after, but I digress. As well as Edgar Casey as well, the known quote unquote psychic.
Sleeping prophet, John. It was the sleeping prophet.
Yes. So they of course mentioned that kind of it was like Mankind Research Unlimited was kind of like based off of a mixture of Wilhelm Reich and Edgar Casey. It's
just really what the world needed. Well, that's at least what its stated purpose was. Reality is a little bit different. Now, one of the theories I've been working with a group of researchers is that this was one of the outposts of the quote-unquote Collins elite. And then I should emphasize the whole concept of the Collins elite as laid out by Nick Redfern is itself a kind of psychological warfare effort. So when I'm saying Collins elite, it's with quotations around it. But I digress. Anyway, the important thing here to emphasize is how much of a Navy project this was.
Oh, very much so.
Something
very much so.
See with all of this kind of woo-woo UFO type stuff, so much of it originates with the United States Navy. And to elaborate a bit on this, it's, not just Carl S.
Navy intelligence too, as well, mainly Recluse,
Well,
which
yes,
Carl
yes.
Schleisler was a tenured member of.
And I mean, he wasn't the only one. Also, Stephen D. How do you pronounce the last name, John?
Pisoni.
Brisson was Office of Naval Intelligence during the Second World War. Another gentleman that we're going to talk about here in a little bit, Richard Allen Miller, was also a Navy man. So there was a very strong Navy presence at MRU. And another one I would like to point out here is one that you don't hear a lot about, and that is Eldon Byrd. That's Eldon Byrd, Byrd. Now, he was a guy who had worked in the Navy, the surface weapons facility or something like that. But anyway, the important thing here to naval surface weapons. Okay, the important thing to emphasize about Byrd and his stated biography, and anything stated by MRU should be taken with a grain of salt.
Of course.
As he claimed, this was the Office of Non-Lethal Weapons, which again is all this psychotronic stuff we've been alluding to. And another interesting thing I would like to point out about Mr. Byrd before we move on is that he was a Mormon. So that's also very interesting in light of the fact that Mr. Levitt was also a Mormon, but not entirely unsurprising when you realize that so much of modern day ufology is sponsored by prominent Mormons such as Brandon Bugle, the owner of Skinwalker Ranch, and also a big tycoon in real estate. In fact, it's rather interesting when you look at people like Robert Bigelow, who was not a Mormon, but who did frequently do business with them. Another big real estate developer, the guy who ended up sponsoring a lot of people who were involved in non-lethal weapons research at some point in the U.S. intelligence community. So that's, another interesting thing when you kind of look at some of this stuff with real estate in that particular area. But getting back to MRU, you had a lot of these curious Navy guys here. A lot of these guys did have experience in psychotronic weapons. And one other name I'm going to throw out there before I turn it back over to you, John, is a certain Cleve Baxter, another guy who had connections to them. He was an army man, unlike many of these individuals. But Baxter, is usually depicted as a rather kooky figure. He, after all, claimed that he could communicate with plants using a polygraph device. So, yeah. But this guy actually was, in fact, an OG Project Bluebird guy. We have documentation on that as well. He knew a lot of interesting figures going back to that era, including L. Ron Hubbard around 1949, 1950, thereabouts. And in his latter years, Mr. Baxter became involved with a certain Sovereign Order of St. John. And there's a lot of interesting things about the Sovereign Order of St. John related to the woo-woo kind of stuff. They also had a keen interest in orgone energy, to put it mildly. And at one point, they also tried to recruit Ingo Swann, the remote viewer, into their ranks. So, yes, there was the presence of the SOSJ, and that is something to keep in mind for later on in this particular show. So, on that note,
and I guess one thing to circle back, something that you might find interesting. I think you already know that, but Pisoni was on the board of directors of the American Security Council.
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, he was also involved with the Freedom Studies Center, which was effectively part of the ASC psychological warfare efforts. It was specifically overseen by the Institute for American Strategy, but it was very closely related to the ASC, including having John Fisher, the founder and longtime president of the American Security Council, on its board. But an interesting thing about that Freedom Studies Center, it was located in Boston, Virginia, if I remember correctly, which was also a small town that happened to house a commune owned by a certain organization known as the Finders, which we will be getting to here.
And Pisoni was a board member of the Committee for Inter-American Security, along with CMP Larry Pat and CMP Patrick J. Buchanan. So
Pisoni was a big guy in a lot of this. He also was involved in the UFO stuff as well. In fact, he was a part of the infamous Robertson panel, which was assembled by the U.S. intelligence community to discuss the UFO question pretty early in the game. I think it was around 1950, but I'm probably wrong on that, so don't quote me. But the important thing to keep in mind with Pisoni on this, he was the only member of the panel with an expertise in psychological warfare, even though that was one of the major topics of discussion by the panel.
So what do you think Mankind Research Unlimited was doing with these Curlian type photographs? Because I have a source for my finder's book who knew Carl Schleisler and worked for Mankind Research Unlimited and stayed with the finders in their W Street apartment in the basement. And he said that Carl Schleisler used to pay him to just transport the Curlian photographs around to different people within the United States. I would assume there's probably some other information that was in there with the photographs that Carl didn't want mailed, but instead wanted my source to drive around and give to certain people. So, I mean, anything you've heard about that Recluse at all by chance or anything?
No, I haven't really looked at the Krillian photography very much, though. I mean, my kind of gut reaction to something like that is that it would probably be designed, at least in part, to target the Russians. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, this is like kind of something that a lot of people don't realize. I mean, like, okay, so the whole ancient astronauts thing, for instance, I mean, this is something that the Soviet Union had actually started to formally push around 1950, the late 1950s, early 1960s. This is, a good decade or so before Chariot of the Gods really gets going and ancient astronaut stuff takes off in the US. So there's a certain school of thought that some of this was actually a kind of psychological warfare effort targeting the Soviet Union because their elites did have an interest to a certain point in this kind of stuff. And kind of the same thing with the psychotronics. There's always a question, really, in all of this type of research as to just how much of it were the intelligence services of the US and the Soviet Union gaslighting one another with this, weird woo-woo kind of stuff. So it's a bit of part of the mysteries of the Cold War, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, we also there was Carl Schleister also worked for SCI too as well. That was out of Arlington, Virginia, the Systems Consulting Incorporated, which MRU was. SCI is actually the parent company of Mankind Research Unlimited. And of course, SCI had significant ties in with the CIA and the Pentagon, even more than Mankind Research Limited of itself. And SCI, of course, was headquarters in Georgetown, which we're going to discuss maybe some connections between a certain person who founded the Fighters Cult and him being trained at Georgetown and Mankind Research Unlimited. But yes, there's direct connections between the parent company Mankind Research Unlimited, which was SCI, and its connections to the military industrial complex and being funded by the Central Intelligence Agency. And
Why don't you tell us then a bit about the Finders, John? I know this is your bread and butter, and they definitely have a lot of connections to the whole saga of MRU, even though it's very rarely addressed.
oh yes, of course. So most people probably recognized the Finders Cult from the Tallahassee incident that occurred on February 4th, 1987, where Finders Cult members Douglas Edward Ammerman and Michael Hollowell were arrested they were arrested in Myers Park in Tallahassee, Florida, when a concerned citizen, City Peterson, notified the Tallahassee Police Department that she observed 6 children playing in Myers Park, and the 6 children were poorly dressed, bruised, dirty, and behaving like wild animals. So Tallahassee police officers Tony Mashburn and Judy Shishoki showed up to Myers Park to investigate. Of course, they would arrest Douglas Ammerman and Michael Hollowell. And they would take the kids into custody, and then started a months long saga with the Finders Cult, who was founded by Marion Petty in the 1960s. It is my belief that the Finders Cult, which I dubbed the Finders Operation, was a multi-government ran operation, primarily likely by the United States Central Intelligence Agency, among other United States governmental organizations, in my belief, to control the counterculture movement of the 1960s and the 1970s and to infiltrate it, as well as to blackmail through possibly, allegedly, acts of pedophilia and child trafficking of foreign diplomats and people within the United States government. The finders were also providing CIA trainment to CIA officers using computers in their warehouse in Washington, D.C., which I have a good authority of a source that is in my book where that was occurring. So yeah, but anyway, so the kids were found to be, in my opinion, abused, the bare minimum, mentally and physically, within the cult's weird practices of child rearing. The sexual abuse allegations against the children cannot be, especially the allegations that were brought forth about Mary Arico, who are her real name is Jordan Arico, and the allegations that were brought against her, that allegations she had mentioned about the finder, should I say, I cannot substantiate those allegations. The doctor who had examined the finder's children for sexual molestation is deceased. So it is my belief that the finders, through the raid that occurred in the Washington, D.C. Warehouses by Ramon J. Martinez, a United States Customs officer, and his partner Robert Harold, United States Customs officer, and the information that's in the infamous report, Ramon J. Martinez's Customs report, that's been circulating in conspiracy history for decades. It was brought to light very strongly by investigative reporter and author Nick Bryant. It's my belief that those allegations are somewhat true from my own research at the finders, and we don't really know whom within the finders knew exactly what was going on. The nefarious of the entire group, it was probably very highly compartmentalized, but it's my belief that Marion Petty likely, controlled or knew a majority of what occurred. So we have, through 3 FBI drops, that there was likely human trafficking and child trafficking involved with the finders. Like I mentioned earlier, control of the counterculture movement. We'll discuss, connections of Marion Petty to Carl Schleissler, Mankind Research Unlimited in a minute, and the finders, as well as information trafficking and gathering techniques. And I do believe, not with 100% certainty, with good certainty, that the claims of magic being practiced by the finders, I do believe those to be true as well, based off of my research, that they were into the occult. But the kids were later released to the custody of their parents, whom within the finder, all 6 children, Max Livingston, Galen Knopf, James Michael Hollowell III, Honeybee Evans, BB said, and Jordan Messina Arico, they were all released to their parents. They were all kids of people within the finders operation. They were not trafficked children and of themselves. And so that's and the case was dropped after that. It kind of disappeared into the media dropped covering the case, and the finders investigation was dropped. Ramon J. Martinez says that he was told, and John Stitcher was told, that it was dropped because it was an internal CIA matter, that they had dropped the investigation on purpose. My informant, Henry Skip Clements, told me the same too as well, that had occurred, former CIA agent. So yeah, I mean, it seems like that was the case. And then there's been a few people that have talked about it since then and reported it. But yeah, so that's the finders in a nutshell. And so Carl Schleisler, the information that we have as far as his connection to Marion Petty from as far as Mankind Research Unlimited is concerned, comes from Toby Terrell, who was a Finders Operation member. He wrote a book, Marion Petty's Life, called The Game Caller. And in there, outside of my own anonymous source in my book, who used to stay with the Finders, who worked directly for Carl Schleisler and carrying the Curlian photographs across the country, like I mentioned earlier. He knew that Marion Petty directly worked with Carl Schleisler. And they knew each other quite frequently. So I can back up Toby Terrell, as well as Christopher Bird was really good friends with Marion Petty. That's well known. Toby Terrell also wrote about that in his book. Of course, Christopher Bird worked directly with Carl Schleisler, Mankind Research Unlimited. Toby Terrell, when he went into Carl's office, he described it on the walls are Curlian photographs of hands emitting sparks of energy from the fingertips. You have pictures of UFOs, dowsers in a circle with willow sticks all pointing downward, and a man sitting in a lotus position inside of a pyramid. We talk a bit, and I get a schedule of the events that he has planned. There's something happening several nights a week. His office has become a mecca for a certain type of person, and this type is more interesting than the mainstream. And then Toby Terrell, Mary Petty visits some of Carl Schleisler's settings, and Terrell wrote, I take the schedule back to Petty, and we attend several of the sessions. The first is a demonstration of psychokinesis. There's a crowd of about 20 people in the room, all focused in a table at the center of the room. On the table is a clear glass dome, like a goldfish bowl, that's been turned upside down. Inside is a lightweight metal device suspended at a needle point with tiny wings on both sides. When the demonstration is to begin, Schleisler announces that he's about to make a phone call to Miami, where the source of psychic energy awaits. When the phone is answered, he tells the person on the other end that we're all ready and we should begin to concentrate on making the device turn on its needlepoint axis. We all watch anticipation, expecting to see the wings begin to spin. Nothing happens. Schleisler calls back again to find out what went wrong. A second attempt is made. Still nothing happens. We walk away chuckling to each other. He should have had a magnet hidden somewhere, says Marion Petty, so that the audience wouldn't be disappointed. He lost a lot of potential customers there that night. I don't know whether he's honest or dumb. People want to believe stuff like that. I used to go to see a lot of magic shows. I went to see them every night, try to figure out how he did this thing. I even followed him up to Philadelphia and watched the show up there. I never could figure out. I never became a believer. But the fighters would still do jobs with, I guess, for Mankind Research Unlimited on behalf of Marion Petty. There's even a story about fighters operation members Diane Sherwood and Barbara Sylvester trying to get money out of Schleisler, who would always stiff the Finders for their work. So I mean, Marion Petty, directly was in the Mankind Research Unlimited nexus. Being a good friend of Christopher Bird, being working with and sending the Finders to do jobs for Mankind Research Unlimited and Carl Schleisler. I mean, a lot of people haven't discussed their connections. I'll probably dig and probably find more if I keep looking, hopefully. But yeah, I mean, they're definitely within the nexus of each other for sure.
Now, something else interesting in the Toby Terrell book, obviously Marion Petty was known as a game caller, and at one point he points out that Carl was his own game caller.
That's correct. Yes. Yeah.
So something that's interesting to keep in mind.
Game recognizes game, huh?
That's interesting in light of some of the figures that we're going to be getting into here in a minute. Actually, I suppose right now. So the MRU network has proven to be shockingly enduring. In the 21st century, it was dominated by Richard Allen Miller and his ex-wife, Iona Miller. John, can you give us the rundown of these particular individuals?
Yeah, so Dr. Richard Allen Miller, who I myself have talked to, it's like with Mankind Research Unlimited in that you have to look at everything about Carl Schleisler's life, even Marion Petty's life, and the work of Mankind Research Unlimited and try to find out, okay, what's really true here or what's mythos, all right? So the same thing you could apply to the Millers, right? I mean, the Millers in of themselves have been on many different alternative media shows. You probably have heard Richard Allen Miller. Richard Allen Miller has been on Coast to Coast AM many times. I mean, I remember hearing him on, I believe I want to say the Jeff Rentz show, if I remember correctly. I could be mistaking on that, but I believe that was the first time I ever heard Dr. Richard Allen Miller. He was discussing his beliefs of what happened at 9/11 and the involvement of C-60 or buckyballs. So yeah, I was thinking that was the first time I had listened to Dr. Richard Allen Miller. And so, Dr. Miller claims, like you mentioned earlier, that he is former Navy intelligence. He claims a lot. Now, what's true and what's not, that's up to for interpretation. Or which you can back up through other sources, that's true. That being said, however, I will say this. Dr. Richard Allen Miller is a very brilliant man. He is highly intelligent. That is true. But what he's been involved with, what he claims to be involved with is anybody's guess. I mean, what have you came across, Recluse, before I expound more as far as Richard's concerned? What have you heard? What have you come across? What are the most out there claims that Dr. Richard Allen Miller makes that he's been involved in?
I'm not really an authority on the claims that he's made. I've never really been very interested in those, more so in like who he's connected to. Probably better positioned to handle that than me.
Yeah, so
he appeared with something, and pretty much anybody who like takes anything associated with Serpo seriously is going to have to spill some serious bullshit. So, and he did support Project Serpo for a time with Project Camelot and so forth. So,
alien technology, magic, hydroponics. Actually, his hydroponic stuff's probably one of the things that, he's going around, hopefully in good faith, teaching kids how to grow food and using hydroponics. So, I'm not necessarily against people, teaching how to use hydroponics, but magic with a K, all sorts of high weirdness, studying, where do I even begin? Metaphysics.
Didn't he claim to be able to find landmines with a dowsing rod?
Yes.
That's a good one.
So, did you ask Arturo Taflorsky Lestat? Did you ask him if when you had him on, did you ask him about supposed communications between Thomas Schoenberger and Dr. Richard Allen Miller?
Oh, yes. He definitely told me that Schoenberger was connected to Richard Allen Miller and Iona Miller, which put him in kind of that whole milieu with Project Camelot, along with Benjamin Fulford.
Yeah, Arturo's done a massive amount of research, and I have to give hats off to him. There's emails where Dr. Richard Allen Miller says that he knows that Thomas Schoenberger is the reincarnation of the Count of Saint Germain. I've seen them. They exist.
Sadly, he wasn't the only one either. I've seen other emails with people claiming that Schoenberger was the reincarnation of the Count Saint Germain. It's very sad.
And not true. So Dr. Richard Allen Miller, discussed that he's
Do we even have to state that it's not true, John?
Well, no. There's people that still believe that Trump's a god emperor and he's in QAnon. Okay,
right.
So
I forget people take Ascended Masters teachings actually seriously. So.
And very much is infiltrate. JFK Jr. is still alive. What am I supposed to say? He's being pushed by Kerry Cassidy and Project Camelot's website. So, but he's seen the Nazi Antarctic base. I own them. They both were. Dr. Richard Allen Miller worked for Mankind Research Unlimited, like almost since its foundation. in the late 60s and the early 70s. Like he worked directly for Carl Schleisler. I mean, there's, the infamous picture of the business card that Dr. Richard Allen Miller had working for Carl Schleisler and working for Mankind Research Unlimited. So, I mean, I don't know. What am I supposed to, do I believe that they're working for the government? Yes. Do I believe that, they're working in, I guess, their most recent research being in noetic sciences and Schumann resonancy and stuff like that and everything. I guess. I don't know. The more you research this stuff, do you really think that these people are true believers, or do you think they're just getting paid to put out this crap? And what's your honest opinion, Stephen? Do you think they really, really believe in this esoteric woo-woo crap?
I think it's both. I mean, that's like the thing, I mean, for this kind of stuff to be really effective, you need the true believers out there. Now, I don't know if the really senior people behind this stuff believe in it, but I mean, the, lower level operators, I definitely think a lot of them are true believers. That's kind of the first principle of magic, according to Bruno. You gotta believe. Both the magician and the audience have to believe implicitly in what the magician is doing. So probably works best with psychological warfare, which is closely related to employ true believers.
Yeah, I guess I would agree with that, I guess.
I'm sure the money helps, fuel the belief as well. I mean, especially when you get into this, kind of new age circles with the secrets and that type of thing. I mean, it just sort of becomes a self-perpetuating circle jerk. I mean, the universe is rewarding you because you're, carrying out the Pleiadian agenda or something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, but again, most people that talk about this new age nonsense, a lot of them aren't the brightest, bulbs, but Dr. Richard Allen Miller is brilliant. It's just there's a fine line between brilliance and insanity, So I don't know how much of what he's talking about you could really apply it to true quote unquote scientific method. And things that he talks about is just in his own head. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely, John. A lot of it is in their own head. So yes, absolutely.
And, I think as well, that's a question we can ask about a lot of these people, like Michael Aquino, for example. Does he really believe in all of the Temple of Set stuff, or is it just an operation? And there's no doubt that Aquino is a very intelligent man, but he may well be a true believer in this stuff as well, just based on how committed he's seemed to it. And I think that
my research partner, Keith Allen Dennis, often says it best. It's that magical point you reach when, you've stuck your head so far up your own ass that you can see God. I think that's like the state many of these guys have achieved.
And I do think that Dr. Richard Allen Miller knows a lot about herbs and plants and horticulture. I really do believe on that stuff that you could that I think you could prove. His information on that is pretty solid. Okay. I would discount as a Christian the magical aspect that he talks about of those things. But from the straight botany aspect of those things, I think there's good information there. I think he knows what he's talking about. From at least for what I've seen and from what he's written, it appears that to be the case, but we're talking about quantum computing and noetic sciences and stuff like that. I mean, it's anybody's guess. Of course, we also have George. Would you like to briefly touch on? Is there any? Go ahead, Recluse. Ask George. What am I even saying? I was about to lead to something. I was about to.
It's all right. It's all right. Well, before we get on to George, though, let's double back to Schoenberger here for a second, because there's one thing about this. I mean, we need to point out. I think so. Schoenberger, for those of you who haven't followed John and us religiously, for a while now, was the guy who game jacked Cicada 3301, one of the gnarliest internet games, or should say alternate reality games from 2012. When exactly this happened is a matter of debate, but certainly by about 2015 or so, he was in control of what was being passed off as Cicada by that point in time. Now, there is a lot of compelling evidence that Schoenberger would go on to help set up the whole QAnon thing, and would continue to pump it massively online, contrary to the popular narrative of that, well up to the events of January 6th. So that's another interesting component.
He was definitely involved in. I think Schoenberger's main job, because Schoenberger, you know, his wife was related directly to Najimy, who was partners with Beyond Khan, and Beyond Khan, of course, was partners with Michael Flynn in the formation of the Flynn Intel Group. However, I wanted to state that with Schoenberger, I believe his job for the QAnon operation, among possibly being FBI and not on 4chan, as Arturo's alluded to with evidence, is that I believe that he was the runner of the higher ups to give talking points, should I say, to people who were pushing the QAnon mythos and information, kind of like among like a group of YouTubers, because YouTubers would come out and say that they had talked directly with Thomas Schoenberger or pushed certain narratives by Thomas Schoenberger, for example, like Nathan Stoltman from Lift the Veil. So I think that was primarily Schoenberger's job, among other things, was to kind of push the narratives that he was giving from up high of higher people in the operation, like let's say maybe Michael Flynn, for example, let's say maybe Stanley McChrystal, for example, among others, out there to these influencers who were true believers, opportunists, and operatives, a mixture depending on which person it was, to push the QAnon information and mythos out to the general public through various platforms.
Well, what I wanted to touch on was essentially this sort of legacy of games, really, with Mankind Research Unlimited. I mean, this was something I had gotten to earlier with the whole concept of game calling that Marion Petty had pushed, and then later it kind of alluded to Carl Schlesinger also being his own game caller. And then, of course, we sort of see this continuing on, up into the modern era with these alternate reality games. Obviously, Schoenberger ran at least one that we know of, possibly more. I believe there was some evidence that Richard Allen Miller had also participated a little bit in Cicada stuff as well. So, this is kind of interesting in light of the fact that there was also a Finders ARG, right, John?
There was, correct. Yes, there was. Still to this day, we have no idea who put that out, or why it was put out. But yes, there was a Finders ARG that was put out with what's the town in South Carolina, the very small town that was involved in the Finders ARG. Give me a minute.
I
George,
can't help
you know
you
offhand by chance?
No, not offhand, man.
Yeah, this sounds super familiar, but no, this slipped.
Pelzer to South Carolina. That's it. Where they Pelzer. One interesting thing about Pelzer is they claim that Pelzer had the they had one of what was it? Hold on, let me find it. They had one of the supposedly one of the dare stones that told the story of the lost colonists of Roanoke. But I haven't proved whether or not that's been authentic or not. And I've heard around Pelzer that there's this very small town in South Carolina, where I've heard from a podcast that there was a very strong occultish and Masonic presence in Pelsner. So it's weird that they just chose that town. That Finders member Stuart Miles Silverstone supposedly was, doing this ARG from Pelsner, South Carolina, which of course I don't think that's true. Stuart Miles Silverstone is in his 80s and is currently living in California. But whoever used that ARG to say it was him through a series of videos on YouTube's and kind of cryptic type messages that, cryptographical type messages and cryptic messages and everything, they kind of try to push it with Pelsner, South Carolina. But yes, I'm well aware of the Finders alternate reality game.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting thing, and that's, kind of something I think we've been alluded to is this just this whole sort of use of myth making by this sort of milieu of individuals as well. I mean, besides all of the nefarious stuff that they actually commit, I mean, they kind of build up this, legacy as well around a lot of their activities. It's really fascinating. I mean, on top of everything else, how I mean, there's also this kind of this blending of reality, if you will, by a lot of these circles. All right. Well, on that note, George, do you have anything to add about Dr. Richard Allen Miller?
Yeah, I do. And I mean, funnily enough, this is honestly what put Mankind Research Unlimited on the map for me to begin with. And I even remember, going up to John, asking him, hey, have you ever heard of this before? Because it shocked me, sounded a hell of a lot like the Finders operation. And of course, he had and knew all about the way that it was connected. And that's also what led me in turn to finding out about William Job Levitt and Larry Wayne Harris in the first place. But like you mentioned in the intro, I one of the cases that I investigate is the case of serial killer Ted Bundy. And for a number of years, I've been of the opinion that Ted Bundy, the story that we've been told about Ted Bundy, is a lone killer who, simply killed all of his victims for nothing more than his own, own depraved motives, which certainly did exist. But there was also, in my opinion, much more to those cases than that. That in some cases there were specific motives, and in some of them, the victims may not have been killed immediately, and also in some of them, the uh, there is indications that other people than Ted Bundy were responsible for some of them. Now, in at the beginning of Ted Bundy's the serial killing spree, there was there were a number of young women from the Northwest Pacific Northwest area who were basically vanishing without a trace from college campuses and the like. And on March 12th, 1974, that occurred to a woman by the name of Donna Gale Manson, who attended the Evergreen State College up in Olympia, Washington. And Donna Gale Manson, she disappeared without a trace and was ultimately assumed to be one of Ted Bundy's many victims, although he was never really convicted. He never really convicted of this. He allegedly, made a lot of deathbed confessions, but there's no real definitive confirmation about this. But in any case, Donna Gale Manson, particularly out of all these other women in the Pacific Northwest who vanished and were attributed to Bundy, has a very interesting background because of her unique level of interest in occult and related topics. She was very fascinated. So first of all, she attended the Evergreen State College, like I said, which is an experimental type of college, sort of renowned as a hippie college back in the time. Students were given very free reign to choose their own curriculums and craft them, and everything was sort of laid back experience there. Uh, anyway, Donna was very fascinated with topics like magic, witchcraft, occultism. She was described by some witnesses in police files, with obtained the police files from her investigation to have a lot of interesting clues. And they talk about her, very curious level of interest in death. She was very fascinated with that. So she was a girl, young woman attending college with some very esoteric interests, and was also written about in Anne Rule's book, pointing to her interest in parapsychology. That there were, basically were pieces of paper in her room indicating her interest in this so-called Thought Power Inc. This which was also known as the Institute of Insight, which is basically this whole sort of parapsychology thing revolving around this idea of the power of the mind and everything, and that sort of in line, I would say, with some of the things that Mankind Research Unlimited work with. And the Institute of Insight was purported to be teaching these, doing all these seminars about controlling your consciousness and cosmic beings, all sorts of these weird, wooey topics, like we mentioned earlier in the show. And other interesting things about this Institute of Insight, there was their logo was apparently it was the Maltese cross, which had an association with these orders of St. John. And one of their instructors, Jean de Verveer, taught a class in Brownsville, Texas, right across the border from Matamoros, Texas, where the infamous satanic cult was located in 1989. But anyway, about the particular connection with Donna Gale Manson is that, her interest in the occult was so strong that she was actually doing a sort of project, like she wanted to do a school project about this stuff. And so she was recommended to reach out to a faculty advisor at the University of Washington's experimental campus. And that faculty advisor was none other than Richard Allen Miller. And, it's confirmed, from Richard Allen Miller's own website, he was indeed in the Pacific Northwest at the time. He, was in fact calls himself basically the Western Regional Director for Mankind Research Unlimited. So he working directly under Dr. Carl Schleicher. So he was pretty much Carl Schleicher's man on the Pacific Northwest. And it is very, very interesting to see that one of Ted Bundy's alleged victims who has these associations is right there, in the thick of, right there connected directly to this naval intelligence person who seems to be on the fringes of some of the, mind control type of and parapsychology research that the intelligence services were into. And, for Donna Gale Manson, who would vanish not too long after and be attributed to Bundy, to have that direct association with this apparent, U.S. intelligence mind control person always, caught my interest. And especially when you look at all these other bizarre aspects of the Donna Gale Manson case, the fact that, she alluded to connections with the Symbionese Liberation Army, which is another sort of CIA-created front, that yet another one of Ted Bundy's victims, Susan Raincourt, her sister, I believe her name was Sandy Smithson, was a part-time security officer at the Evergreen State College a decade later, and she claimed to have ESP abilities as well, in line with the stuff that the Institute of Insight and these other parapsychology groups were into. So you have the sort of parapsychology connections show up in multiple people in the Bundy case, and then with Donna herself, there are multiple witness reports indicating that she actually was not dead right at the time of her abduction, that she was in the company of hippie people or in the company of bikers for several months after her disappearance. And also there was one account that she was associated with Ted Bundy and another man named Steve Brown, who were both involved together in a narcotics business in Tacoma, Washington. So there's a lot more evidently to the Donna Gale Manson story. She has a unique interest in these sort of mind control things that are very connected to mind control activities that the CIA and other U.S. intelligence agencies were working. And she's right there having none other than Richard Allen Miller as her faculty advisor. And as far as I know, no one has dug this out before, that that one of Ted Bundy's victims was connected directly to this top level person at Mankind Research Unlimited.
Yeah, it is absolutely fascinating connection there.
Yeah, George, I don't remember when we came across that information, but I think it also reminded me too, I didn't mean to cut you off, Recluse, was that I think it was when Mark from Housatonic Live was doing his research around the same time into Ted Bundy being working, being good friends and working directly under the governor of the state of Washington, Daniel Jackson Evans, the ardent neocon. And
Right.
Evans was also very much connected and friends with Bill Gates Sr. But yeah, that's something I wanted to make note of real quick.
Yeah, and it was, I've been on the whole Bundy thing for a while, and there are many different avenues to approach with it. I mean, the Washington state political connections and other associated connections. Bundy was, of course, at the University of Washington, got a psychology degree, and that puts him in close proximity to some doctors like Dr. Donald Dudley, who are known definitively to have done MK Ultra work at the same place. And then we have Richard Allen Miller being at University of Washington's experimental campus doing his own sort of mind control adjacent activities at Mankind Research Unlimited. So it's a very interesting brew up there in Washington. And of course, the other side of Bundy is the evidence in the particular cases of his, that there was a lot more to them, that it wasn't just simple serial killings, but that there were some of them, like Donna Gale Manson, appear to have survived for some period of time. There are overlaps with biker gangs and these other, these countercultural groups, that there is, there are indications some of these other cases that drug trafficking plays a role, including, with Bundy's purported friend Steve Brown, who supposedly met Donna Gail Manson alongside Bundy is another, there are all sorts of interesting things about the Bundy matter that very clearly indicate ties to organized crime and also ties to the intelligence services. And Richard Allen Miller is a very curious piece, but is also, just one piece among so many of them.
Okay, so let's see here. All right, so let's return to the incident we opened with, the purported anthrax attack. Now, George, this Harris character had some interesting ties to Ohio State University that you've been alluding to. OSU turns up in a lot of this kind of research. What can you tell us about some of those additional connections?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Ohio State University is, it's literally described in CIA documentation as a place where they do recruiting from. This is, easily verifiable. And of course, the CIA recruits from many universities, but Ohio State University in particular is interesting due to its, I should say, its close proximity to other biowarfare operations in the rest of the state. There is a company based in Ohio known as Battelle Laboratories and the Battelle Institute. And the Battelle Institute back in, especially back in the early 21st century, they were basically given the contract to make the anthrax vaccine for the U.S. military in conjunction with Bioport that some people may have heard of, which is of course connected to the infamous DynCorp. And in the process of doing that, Battelle, of course, also worked with very potent strains of anthrax. And like I said before, biowarfare really is a double-edged sword. If you're supposedly defending against it, you have to do everything. You have to know how it works. You have to be able to make it. And of course, that gives plausible deniability for anyone who wants to make bioweapons to just say that they're doing defensive research. And the Battelle, which is based in Ohio, very that's a very interesting thing to see in proximity to OSU. And of course, with Larry Wayne Harris getting that microbiology degree, it raises questions of what sorts of activities he was actually connected to. And that Ohio State University in particular has some interesting benefactors on its board of trustees, with the I guess the most infamous one of them being none other than Les Wexner, the head of the Limited Consortium, which owns companies like Victoria's Secret and better known in our circles as being Jeffrey Epstein's likely handler for intelligence. He was on the board of trustees from 1988 to 1997, meaning that he was basically there up to just 1 year before this incident. So he very likely had some. It's very plausible that he would have had some overlap with these activities that were going on in the state at the time. He was again on the board of trustees from 2005 to 2012, and in fact, he was chairman of the board of trustees from 2009 to 2012. So that is so Les Wexner being a spooky character who seems to have been Epstein's handler, who has a number of connections to organized crime, who reportedly was involved in bringing the Southern Air Transport, the CIA drug trafficking airline, to the state of Ohio in conjunction with the aid to the Ohio's then governor Paul Mifsud, who was a Knight of Malta. Les Wexner has a number of very blatant intelligence connections, not just to Israeli intelligence through the mega group, which are very commonly talked about, but also to our very own CIA. So that in particular is a sign that OSU is very much involved in some intelligence linked operations. And there was a curious story a couple years back, a still unsolved disappearance from 2006 in Columbus, of a man named Brian Schaefer. And Brian Schaefer was a microbiology student at Ohio State University. And on April 1st, 2006, he just vanished. He was at a bar, and then he was last seen on video, right outside of the bar, and then he disappeared. He's never been seen since. And no one has found him. There have been no real clues as to where he might be, what happened to him. There's some curious things that come out of this case, including that in 2009, basically Brian Schaefer's friend who was with him that night was named William Florence or Clint Florence, and Florence became a suspect in the case and refused to take any polygraphs or anything, which of course is not a sign of guilt necessarily, but he wasn't really helping. He wasn't really helping out the investigation. He perhaps justifiably thought that he would just be considered the likely suspect, and he kind of clammed up. But his lawyers did. His lawyers did at one point communicate with a private investigator for the Schaefer family, and basically said that they had spoken to a detective on the case and believed that Brian Schaefer was still alive. And this was sort of just dropped in 2009, then never really talked about again. But that there's some evidence that Brian Schaefer, who disappeared mysteriously, might still be alive, is certainly a curious thing. And one of the theories that's come up is that Brian Schaefer may have been recruited into some kind of secret, basically this secret underground type of intelligence operation, knowing that OSU was a CIA recruiting school, knowing that he was in microbiology, which is of course a very hot topic. And not that only a couple years prior, there were a number of mysterious deaths of microbiologists around the country that people suspected back then were linked to the anthrax attacks. And then to have Brian Schaefer at OSU, who is a microbiologist, just disappear out of nowhere and then supposedly still be alive is rather strange, and I would say somewhat reminiscent perhaps of Donna Gilmanston herself, who just was interested in some of these weird esoteric interests and then vanished and had signs of still being alive, even though she was pretty much assumed officially to be dead. And I think that when you get into these orbits, there are a lot of people, people who disappear in this country. They don't always they're not always necessarily dead. Sometimes they go into various underground worlds and programs that we don't know a lot about. Sometimes they might they get their lives get reinvented, put in these sorts of secretive witness protection type deals. And yeah, it's just there's a lot of mysterious stuff swirling around OSU, especially when it comes to their microbiology programs. And the whole state of Ohio in general is a very very distinct hotbed of this.
Now, John, while we're on that topic, do you want to go into Lex Wexner here a bit for the kids at home, since George already kind of opened that can of worms?
Yes, of course. So, Leslie Herbert Wexner was born in 1937. As George had mentioned, he was the founder and chairman of L Brands. Of course, L Brands was a clothing retailer that L Brands would later incorporate Victoria's Secret, Abercrombie & Fitch, Express, and Bath and Body Works, and Lane Bryant. So Leslie Wexner was born in Dayton, Ohio. Both his parents, Bella and Harry Wexner, were of Russian Jewish origin. Les Wexner went to Ohio State University. He served in the Air National Guard. And his mother, actually, very interestingly enough, Bella Wexner, she became corporate secretary of Wexner's business. It's almost like she handled him very similar to how Gates's mother handled him in Microsoft, actually. Supposedly reported that she was very controlling over Les Wexner. However, later, one thing that I want to mention is that Jeffrey Epstein would replace Bella, kind of like at the boards of the heads of L Brand. And supposedly, even though many people claim that they hate Jeffrey Epstein, whether or not that's true, as far as people in the Epstein nexus, right? In the Les Wexner nexus, later they claim, well, I never knew anything that Jeffrey Epstein was doing, and I severely disliked Jeffrey Epstein, and I thought he was a jerk. I do actually believe that the claims that Bella Wexner disliked Epstein are true, because Epstein did replace her. So I found that to be quite interesting. And so, actually, Recluse, can you give me one quick second real quick? I need to grab my notes that I have for Wexner.
Oh,
if you don't mind.
absolutely, sir.
George, is there anything that you could say about Wexner real quick that you know of that you didn't had mentioned earlier real quick as I grab my
Yeah, I mean, in general, Les Wexner was can talk about his political connections. Like I said, he worked alongside the campaign manager and aide to the Ohio's governor George Voinovich named Paul Mifsud, and Paul Mifsud was a Knight of Malta and also a purported friend of people like George H.W. Bush. So he has those sorts of high-level Republican connections and intelligence connections. He was also linked in with the Bush family itself. First of all, he was very strongly in support of their whole foreign policy agenda in Iraq. With the mega group and everything, he was one of the major out-of-government forces lobbying for it.
yes.
He also, he was also directly associated with Bush family members later on. In 2014, he got George W. Bush to be the headliner for a dinner for basically like this dinner benefit event at his house. In 2015, he was a big donor to a Jeb Bush super PAC. So we all know how that went. So, yeah, I mean, Wexner has a lot of juice.
He also hosted fundraisers for Mitt Romney too, if I remember correctly. And was a big push for Mitt Romney's presidential campaign during 2012. And of course, Wexner now claims that he's independent because of Trump, but
yeah.
I don't believe that.
I mean, it's silly. I mean, considering that it's so obvious that that Trump is caught up in this pedophilic blackmail network. This all for show, really. It's you can talk a big game about distancing yourself from this person or that person, and you can pretend to be bitter enemies. But honestly, I mean, most of that is just a deception for the masses, in my opinion, to make it seem like politics is this game of people bitterly divided when it's really the whole political class against the ordinary people of this country. And I think it's pretty blatant with Wexner and Trump, especially, that that's exactly what's going on.
Yeah. So, okay. So like you mentioned earlier, Leslie Wexner was introduced by insurance mogul Robert Meester to Jeffrey Epstein around 1986. Meester handled the insurance for the limited corporation. Meester had met Epstein prior on a commercial flight to Palm Beach. Epstein told Meester that he wanted to meet Wexner because he had supposed information that Wexner's money manager was stealing money from Wexner. Epstein self-described himself as a financial bounty hunter and told Meester he tracked down missing funds for Wexner. Wexner was in his late 40s when they had met. Epstein was in his early 30s. Jeffrey Epstein, of course, claimed that he'd only accept clients that were worth billions of dollars or more. And Les Wexner was the only publicly known client of Jeffrey Epstein. Alan Dershowitz claimed that he had met Jeffrey Epstein first at Lynn Forrester D. Rothschild's Martha Vineyard's home. Epstein later invited Dershowitz as a guest of honor at Wexner's birthday dinner. Of course, the claims of Maria Farmer that she was kind of like a personal assistant to Jeffrey Epstein, and was also a victim of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell's horrific what they did to Maria Farmer and her sister. But Maria Farmer would go stay at Les Wexner's New Albany, Ohio mansion, and kind of like Epstein's offsuit, where Wexner built kind of like this McMansion community in New Albany, Ohio area. And that she had, when she went there for the summer, because she was told that she was going to be able to make paintings and to paint at Wexner's estate, that she was repeatedly supposedly molested by Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein at that estate that was very heavily guarded. There were sniper towers. There's pictures you could see of the fences where it says guarded by armed guards and by dogs. And of course, Maria Farmer had mentioned at the estate that she had saw frequently Donald John Trump, which many people who don't believe that Jeffrey Epstein had numerous connections to Donald Trump, you can go back and look at a very 2-hour PowerPoint presentation where I showed every connection that I knew of at the time, that Donald John Trump is directly connected to Jeffrey Epstein and still was even possibly after Epstein's arrest, and was very much, knowledgeable and tragically involved with the child trafficking aspect that Epstein was involved with, and acts of pedophilia too as well. Of course, it was brought forth by Katie Johnson, and also, you know, alleged that Trump knew by Maria Farmer, because she also mentioned that I want to say it was it Ivana Trump or was it Marla Maples, George, that was driving around in a limo with Ghislaine Maxwell as they were picking up Victoria's Secret girls, and some of them might have been underage as models. I want to say I think it was Ivana Trump. I think. But Maria Farmer had disclosed that in her interview to Whitney Webb, our two-part interview. I think it was Ivana Trump. But
Yeah,
yes.
I think you're right about that. And
And
I mean, even after the divorce, Ivana Trump would be hanging around this whole Aspen, Colorado social circle, which ties into some of the more, unsavory people who are only a couple degrees away from Epstein, like, Russian mobster Victor Kozini and his partner in crime, work. So, yeah.
So yeah, so I mean, she also mentioned that she saw Dershowitz, which that backs up the allegations by Virginia Roberts Free. And even though Dershowitz mentions that he met Jeffrey Epstein at that Lynn Forrester D. Rothschild Vineyards home dinner or event, there's some information in my PowerPoint presentation that I cannot remember exactly offhand that actually states that Dershowitz knew her sooner than that. If I remember correctly. So let's see here. Some more interesting information is in 1991, Wexner signed a 3-page power of attorney naming Epstein, over being his power of attorney, that he could hire people for him, sign checks for him, sell properties, and borrow money. He was also over trust for Wexner's children. Jeffrey Epstein arranged Les Wexner and Abigail Koppel's marriage. She was in her late 20s when Wexner was in his late 40s at the time. Their prenuptial agreement, it was in attendance of their January 1993 wedding. Epstein supposedly called Alan Dershowitz to ask if he knew anyone in the Clinton administration, because supposedly Wexner was in a panic that customs agents at the Teterboro airport in New Jersey seized thousands of dollars of Cuban cigars and $50,000 in cash from his private jet. Again, Cuban cigars, don't know if it was anything more than that. Cuban cigars are illegal because of the embargo and because some of them possibly can contain marijuana sometimes. So, of course, you mentioned earlier, had, alleged to Les Wexner's connections to drug trafficking. So who knows if that plane had any involvement with that or not. And then, of course, Les Wexner sold Jeffrey Epstein his East 71st Street townhome in Manhattan for supposedly $1. It's reported that there are documents that showed that he paid Les Wexner for $20 million for that property. Supposedly, that East 71st Street townhome, it was supposedly rigged with surveillance equipment, kind of like a brownstone operation, very much akin to what happened during the Franklin scandal with Craig J. Spence and Lawrence E. King, having, Craig J. Spence having a townhome that was also rigged to record sexual blackmail of pedophilic acts. So it seems to be akin to that. Jeffrey Epstein's brother, Mark Epstein's real estate company, had a majority ownership of Manhattan condo building on East 66th Street in New York City, where Jeffrey Epstein originally housed underage girls, which was owned by Les Wexner. Wexner told journalists in 2003 that Epstein had excellent judgment and unusually high standards, adding he was always a most loyal friend. Jeffrey Epstein, both black books, the one that was previously released, the one that was recently released, had numerous numbers, which, some people could argue would make sense because he managed Les Wexner's money and that they were really good friends. But numerous upon numerous numbers for Les Wexner, any number you can possibly have managed to get a hold of him, his wife, his kids, his immediate family. And of course, there were more numbers in the black book for Donald Trump too, as well, and still no direct numbers for the Clintons. Just putting that out there to let people know. But I digress there. In 2019, a Wexner spokesman told the Washington Post that the Wexner served at all times with Jeffrey Epstein in 2007. However, Wexner is still involved with Epstein in business dealings after 2007, and Epstein supposedly transferred $47 million back to Wexner-controlled family fund in 2008 because Les Wexner claims that Epstein was perforating a lot of money from him. So yes, I believe that Lex Wexner was the higher up controller of the Epstein nexus. Of course, George had mentioned his connections with Mega Group that was founded by the Bronfman family. He's got Council for National Policy connections and Wexner himself. Study group that, of course, the ardent Zionists. Leslie definitely should be investigated for everything, and in my opinion, be brought to trial from the foundings of those investigations and the allegations of Maria Farmer. But I don't think, sadly, that's going to happen because Wexner was higher up in the Epstein operation than Epstein was, and even Ghislaine Maxwell at this point. It appears to be so. So
that really is the thing, we can't forget that Maria Farmer outright called Les Wexner the head of the snake.
Yes, very much so.
And I would say the very clearest indication that Les Wexner was the higher up in the relationship. And of course, he now, like you say, tries to distance himself and claim that he was scammed by Epstein, which of course everyone is doing now. It would be pretty dumb not to do that. But what you mentioned about the Brownstone operation is a very important point, and it was basically every property of Epstein's that had the sort of thing going on. Witness accounts about his homes in New York and in Palm Beach, Florida, were also described to have this exact same setup of video recording equipment, permeating the entire house, which of course is very much like Craig Spence, as you mentioned. And what is interesting is that by an account from Jeffrey Epstein's butler, I'm trying to remember which one it was. I think it was.
Was it Alfredo or Alisi? Alisi was the handyman, right?
Yeah, sorry, it was Alfredo Rodriguez.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he, at one point in his deposition, he testified that a technician would fly in from New Albany, Ohio, which is the city that Les Wexner pretty much owned, to go in and manage the video surveillance equipment at the house. So it appears very likely, based on that Les Wexner, was really the one pulling the strings behind these human compromise operations, that it was his technicians coming into Epstein's properties to do this, and that Epstein was given these properties to manage and be the social frontman, but it wasn't really his tapes to use. It was ultimately the people above Epstein who were really maintaining and using it, which is similar to what Craig Spence would sometimes say about how quote unquote friendly intelligence agents were the ones who installed his video equipment and controlled it.
No, very much so, George. And so you have direct connections. Wexner and even the Ohio New Albany McMansions and that whole development, like there should be severe investigation, because very few people, most people talk about the Lolita Express. They talk about the New York mansion. They might talk about Little St. James, which also one thing I forgot to mention. One last thing, if we're talking about all this, is what was the property? There was a Epstein owned a guest house after Wexner sold it to him in 1992 for $3.4 million, but Wexner later purchased it back for $8 million 6 years later. And right after that, Epstein purchased Little St. James for around that price. I think it was like 8.47 million or 8.5 million, somewhere around there. So that's interesting. That's likely that Les Wexner directly funded Epstein's ability to purchase Little St. James. And there's been very famous performances that's happened on the Wexner's estate, including performers who've been there include Ariana Grande in 2013, Demi Lovato in 2008, Jordan Sparks in 2009, and the Jonas Brothers in 2007. So,
Yeah, very interesting. And the whole Disney empire is yet another disturbing rabbit hole we could go down to.
And then it came out in a recent deposition about Epstein that one of Epstein's victims was trafficked and was on Pornhub. So This probably goes deeper than any of us could ever really imagine, right?
No, I'm certain of it. And I mean, the connections that and we've talked about this back, even go to the level of, children being abducted off the streets, not just people who are lured in through modeling or whatever, but girls like the so-called Maria in Katie Johnson's lawsuit, not the same person as Maria Farmer. She was a 13-year-old girl who was basically held captive by Epstein's ring. And then 5 years before that, a girl from Connecticut named Doreen Jane Vincent, whose disappearance has never been solved, but there are definitely many indications pointing to a pedophile ring aspect to what's happened, and it happened in the same time frame and location as Maria's disappearance. So there is a lot of, very clear indications that the ring that Epstein was part of is a parallel to Franklin in so many ways. And
It's likely a continuation of Franklin, I would assume.
yeah, I think the surface has barely even at this point been scratched so far.
Well, now we are going to take quite a deep dive. All right, to wrap up, George, why don't you briefly go over the White Eagle Underground again, the mysterious organization that you and I covered the last time you were on the farm. So give the kids at home a little bit of an overview of it and how you think it relates to this incident in Ohio that we've been kind of using as a touching point for all of this.
The White Eagle Underground is basically this underground sort of domestic terror and also organized crime group that is pretty much alleged to be the sort of main controlling power behind many of these disparate incidences, of child trafficking and drug trafficking and some infamous domestic terror events like the Oklahoma City bombing are all purported to be under the banner of this group. And basically, it is said to be led at the top by essentially a cadre of U.S. military and U.S. intelligence officers, people in like the CIA, the Army, the Air Force, who are essentially pulling the strings. And then at the lower level, it's sort of this coalition between white supremacist groups, groups such as the Aryan Nations, which we mentioned before, and also foreign terrorist groups from Russia, the Middle East, and Germany. And then in addition to, and yeah, I mean, it's basically this sort of coalition of foreign and domestic terror groups working at the behest of these intelligence military services. And then I guess a third sort of wing underneath that is organized crime, like the Mexican cartels in elsewhere in South and Central America, all these various organized crime groups. So basically the common interest between these white supremacist types, these Islamic types, these Russian organized crime people, and these basically Latin American cartels. So all working underneath U.S. military and intelligence. So it is obviously a big parallel to what we've seen about, heard about U.S. intelligence operations throughout the years in cases like Iran-Contra, but it's this alleged umbrella group that is basically responsible for all of this, and they have been essentially it is the name White Eagle Underground sort of comes from one of the many strange religious, quasi-religious spiritual orders that comprises the group. One of the main sort of binding pieces of glue for this group, beyond just the domestic terror and organized crime aspects, is the interest in the occult, which of course is something that's very often shared by many of these elements. White supremacists and white supremacists and Satanists, have a definite overlap. Same with these. Same with the Islamists, which is kind of just the Middle Eastern equivalent of that here. And of course, the Latin American drug cartels frequently practice this stuff too. So the occult is a very common, common thread here. And the White Eagle Lodge which was founded basically, decades ago by British spiritualists, and essentially grew into this sort of big spiritual movement with a base of operations here in the U.S. in Montgomery, Texas, was one of the alleged sort of guiding lights, whose ideology became one of the bedrocks of this group. And then there are other similar organizations like the Brotherhood of the White Temple in Sedalia, Colorado, and the nearby castle of Tweet Kimball, whose husband was a CIA officer under Frank Wisner named Merritt Ruddick. So basically, all of these sort of spiritualist groups and all these basically theosophy-inspired groups kind of came together, formed this weird brew that ultimately turned into this type of white eagle ideology that now is allegedly, per this dossier that I obtained last year, pretty much is the foundation of a lot of the drug trafficking and child trafficking, weapons trafficking, and domestic terror operations that go on throughout the United States for a number of decades now. Now, the way I came onto this whole White Eagle Underground allegation was through looking into the JonBenet Ramsey case. That basically there was this allegation in an article written by Alex Constantine that a suspect named Paul Schultz had been a early person of interest in the JonBenet Ramsey case. Paul Schultz was a pedophile in the Houston area who abused his son Nick Schultz and subjected him to very severe levels of torture. Would be passing him around to other abusers as well, and at the same time was also sort of grooming him, talking about his Aryan supremacy and pure bloodline into being a sort of leader of this group. That there was this group was very sexually abusive, but they also had this sort of white supremacist Nazi undertone to it, and at the same time they also interfaced quite closely with Mexican cartels and that were involved in activities like bringing drugs across the border, murdering police officers, shooting at ships in the bay at Galveston, and also bringing captive children across the border and storing them at these safe houses. So this cult that the victim Nick Schultz described was a very disturbing one, but it had basically had this sort of this coalescence between these unsavory activities and occultism and white supremacy, and basically what grew out of what was mentioned in this case was this basically this belief in this use of terminology that came from the White Eagle Lodge, talking about things like the Star Chamber and calling their leaders first star, second star, stuff like that. So this group, and I believe the name White Eagle Underground was even literally mentioned in the company of Nick Schultz at one point. So basically this whole group basically revealed itself to be one branch of this much larger operation, the White Eagle Underground. And this investigator who was working for the NYPD on a counterterrorism case, because he had heard news that there was a terrorism threat that was originating from white supremacists in the Houston area, targeted against major cities like New York. The NYPD was very concerned about this, since they brought in this consultant who was one of the major sort of writers for a lot of the material in this dossier. He pretty much found leads into this about the White Eagle Underground, and then ultimately found out about the Paul Schultz case and found that as a connection, found another victim in the Houston area another child victim in the Houston area who also was prostituted out by her father to a very similar situation, and also heard the term White Eagle Underground from these people. So there were multiple overlapping cases of child abuse in the same area, talking about this group, which had already been on the trail of had already had the NYPD on their trail. And so basically, this group was fleshed out in the dossier, and there were all sorts of allegations that came out. And I received a copy of the dossier while working one of my sources on the JonBenet Ramsey case last year, and it divulged pretty much all this information that I've related to you now. And it was just very interesting to come across this sort of thing. And I know, Stephen, you felt the same way, that it really tied together so much of these seemingly, this whole mess of activities into this coherent whole in a way. And where it becomes very interesting in connection with what we talked about in the show is an allegation that this domestic terror group was particularly planning attacks revolving around biological warfare, and that their targets were New York City, and of course that they were using white supremacists as the foot soldiers, that there was a top-level connection to U.S. intelligence, and all of this stuff is a very distinct parallel to the alleged plot that we discussed at the beginning of the show with Larry Wayne Harris and William J. Levitt, that Larry Wayne Harris was a lieutenant colonel in the Aryan Nations, so he would be a natural foot soldier in the White Eagle Underground. And of course, it was taking place at basically the same. This was just like a year or two after the dossier. So like right at the time that this investigation of this terror threat was heating up, you pretty much you have Larry Wayne Harris literally saying that he wanted to launch a bioterror attack in New York City, which again is a precise parallel to what's talked about in the dossier, as is what Larry Wayne Harris said about how his friends would target government agents and basically try to disrupt the economy, like try to destroy the economy through this bioterrorism. That's pretty much also exactly what the dossier says the White Eagle Underground is going for in terms of both motive and means. So and of course the connections we talked about with intelligence, people like, Dr. Carl Schleicher being a close associate of William J. Levitt, Levitt's own parents having a plausible intelligence background, and of course him being in the Mormon Church, and his parents being at his father being at that military base close to Area 51 of all things. There's a lot of these interesting intelligence connections in the background of Levitt, and also very likely Harris as well through his time at OSU. And of course, the intelligence services are the ones ultimately said to be pulling the strings in this biowarfare stuff. And then also at Battelle Labs, which I mentioned earlier, based in Columbus, Ohio, there was one of the main researchers for Battelle was this sort of defector from the Soviet Union's biowarfare operations, a guy named, I think, Ken Alabek. And that's interesting too, because it was directly talked about in the dossier how these biological agents would originate from the Soviet Union and also would originate from the Middle East, which of course calls to mind what Larry Wayne Harris was talking about with this Iraqi woman warning him that Iraqis were coming over with these biological weapons samples and plotting attacks that way. And of course, Iraqi suspects do show up in the Oklahoma City bombing as well as being, likely in conjunction, being co-conspirators with Tim McVeigh and Terry Nichols and the rest of their cohort. So, once again, you see this connection, this overlap between white supremacist groups and foreign Islamic terrorist groups, all responsible for these both successful and planned incidents of domestic terror. So, the allegations we see with this particular alleged anthrax plot and with these individuals, Larry Wayne Harris and William W. Levitt, fit right into the framework that the White Eagle Underground dossier talked about. And I'd say it's particularly powerful that the dossier was written before, like a year before, any of this material, any of this information about the anthrax plot ever hit the news. So you have it clear that this wasn't just some dossier made up after the fact based on stories that were popular. This dossier basically predicted a scenario almost exactly like the one that hit the papers, down to the very specific details about a terror attack in New York City with white supremacist groups. So that's sort of the quick and dirty rundown of the White Eagle Underground and how it ties in. Of course, Stephen, you and me did a much more in-depth episode where we really fleshed this out, but that's basically the sort of network that we come back to ultimately, that there is this underground group of people engaged in the most unsavory activities of child trafficking and drug trafficking and domestic terrorism, and it all seems to trace back right to these same intelligence operators at the very top of the food chain, as it always seems to.
All right, now we are going to go on that deep dive I promised you guys. Now, when I first had this thing brought to my attention, I believe it was actually my research partner, Keith Allen Dennis, who first mentioned the White Eagle Underground to me. And then I later found out that George was the one who did the research on it. I immediately thought of the Sovereign Order of St. John. For those of you who have followed me for a while, you know I'm really obsessed with this murky outfit. We talked about it a little bit earlier. But to kind of sum up my thoughts on it briefly, I think it was essentially the American propaganda Dewey. It oversaw a lot of these paramilitary type activities that were related to terrorism in this country. Specifically, it had impeccable ties to the broader Christian Identity Network, which has been implicated in a wide variety of acts of domestic terrorism for many years now. And that's only scratching the surface in that regard. Now, the SOSJ was also into a lot of woo-woo type of stuff, as we alluded to before. They were quite into UFOs, orgone energy. They had contactees like George Hunt Williamson and Delmar de Veras within their ranks and all this kind of stuff. So they certainly seemed to fit the bill for what was being described in this dossier. And I should also point out they had numerous senior military people, many of them with a background in intelligence as well. So that box is also checked. Now, Keith thought so too, and he started going back through our cache of documents, of SOSJ documents, to see if he could find any references to a White Eagle, anything. And sure enough, it turned up. We started seeing references to something called the Order of the White Eagle. Now, these turned up in a cache of documents we have from Congressman Larry McDonald. Yes, that one, the 007 McDonald, the one who went down in the plane crash in 1983 in territory, I believe, that the Soviet Union controlled and almost triggered a world war. So it's a pretty big deal. Now, Larry McDonald was a member of the SOSJ. In fact, he was a member of 3 separate SOSJs. Now, here's where things get really, really hazy, guys, and I'm sorry for this, but we're going to have to go into the whole Judean People's Front moment here as I try to explain this to you. So, the mother of all SOSJs is what is often referred to as the Shiksheni Knights of Malta. This outfit emerged in the mid-1950s and was so referred to as Shiksheni because it was based out of Shiksheni, Pennsylvania for many years. And it was headed by a bizarre figure known as Charles Pichel, another glorious confidence man like so many of the figures we've chronicled in this saga. Pichel had been implicated in drug trafficking during the 1930s. Well, he claimed that he ran a drug rehabilitation facility and he was getting heroin addicts off of heroin by giving them heroin of a higher grade but lower dosages than what the mob was offering or something to that effect. He was a real humanitarian in that sense. He also reputedly had ties to Nazi intelligence and all kinds of other interesting things. How he ended up with this mysterious outfit with so many senior military intelligence officers really baffles the mind, but then again, many of these guys were into really weird stuff too. Pitchell, however, though, really pushed it. So much so that there were frequently schisms outside of or inside the order, leading to new branches of it. Probably when they got into the inner circle and heard him start talking about the Interplanetary Galactic Federation and that type of thing, they might have been a little turned off. Who knows? But anyway, there were a couple of notable ones, and that leads into the different SOSJs that Larry McDonald was tied into. So, using the Order of St. John by a fellow named Guy Stair Sainty, I was able to piece together this murky network. So, first off, you have a European branch of the SOSJ that was headed by a guy named Paul de Granier or something to that effect. He was French. The last name is spelled Granier. I apologize in advance. I know probably many of you out here are having kittens. So anyway, he eventually hooked up with a guy called King Peter II of Yugoslavia. King Peter II had been an intelligence asset during the Second World War of the Special Operations Executive. Specifically, his handler was a guy named Julian Amory, who would go on to become the head of Le Cercle during the 1980s, another glorious fascist organization with ample ties to pedophilia, drug trafficking, arms trafficking, and a host of other intrigues. But that's a side note. So, Granier and King Peter had this thing for a while, this kind of European-centric SOSJ, but things eventually went south, and King Peter went his own way. So, the genesis of the 3 orders that Larry McDonald is involved with have their roots in these 3 groups. The Shiksheni Knights of Malta, this weird French thing with Paul Granier, or whatever, and this King Peter outfit. Now, eventually, through a line of strange successions and so forth, the French group ended up very closely associated with this guy called Prince Alexei, who I believe claimed to be a descendant of some Russian nobility or probably something to that effect. The important thing in this regard is that Prince Alexis eventually hooked up with the quote, some spurious president of the Polish government in exile. It wasn't even like the official Polish government in exile. It was some weird pseudo-Polish government in exile. Yes, apparently there were such a thing. The important thing about this is that this group had possession of the Order of the White Eagle and frequently applied it to the letterheads of those affiliated with the French group. So this seems to have been where the Order of the White Eagle came from in the documents that I have from Larry McDonald. Now, another interesting thing about this French/Polish outfit is that eventually it came into contact with another pseudo-order of St. John, one that had its origins in an Italian branch and eventually ended up in New York City. And one of the members of it was a certain Bishop Del Vilci or something to that effect, who was also a bishop in the American Orthodox Catholic Church. That is the same American Orthodox Catholic Church that Peter Levenda was a member of. The same Peter Levenda who most likely wrote the Simon Necronomicon. So, to recap, this strange French offshoot of the Chickasha Knights of Malta would eventually encompass the Order of the White Eagle and a branch of the American Orthodox Catholic Church, bizarrely enough. So that's weird. All right, getting back to the Larry McDonald papers. Now, the three separate branches that Larry McDonald was involved in had different locations. So the European one was headquartered, surprisingly, somewhere in Europe. I cannot remember off the top of my head. This is the White Eagle one that Larry was in correspondence with on and off pretty regularly. Now, there were two other ones that he was involved with. One of them was based out of Houston, Texas, and this one followed the King Peter II tradition. The third one was based out of Akron, Ohio. It was overseen by a guy called Peter Bunnell, and this one was the one that came out of the Chickasha Knights of Malta tradition. Now, the Ohio-based one was rather prestigious from what I can tell. Besides including Larry McDonald in its rank, it also included John Ashbrook, Donald Lukens, and General John Sinklob. Yes, the same General John Sinklob, who eventually headed the World Anti-Communist League during the 1980s and was involved in a host of other intrigues and nefarious activities. So this does not appear to be a marginal outfit that was based out of Ohio. Now, eventually, this group would engage in numerous activities, one of which was trying to get Summit County to transfer land to the SOSJ so that they could establish a joint senior center and an orphanage. And this is rather interesting because Donald Lukens, I believe, was busted for soliciting sex from underage women at one point, or I should say girls, rather. So, yeah, they're out here setting up an orphanage in Ohio, or I should say attempting to, and they at one point even approached an ambassador from Saudi Arabia to help them get funding and so forth for this orphanage. So yes, you have this strange netherworld here of this group, this quasi-American propaganda Dewey, with all these ties to white supremacist groups and so forth, and also these senior military officers running around here trying to set up an orphanage in Ohio with one member among the ranks who was in fact convicted for soliciting sex from a minor. So, to recap, it does seem to indicate that there is a strong basis in reality for the document that George found, and there are certainly some very strange connections to all of this. Do you guys have any thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, I think, in the end, when you get into this whole realm of parapolitical research, it can be hard to know if you're just chasing after a pattern that seems good or if you're actually really onto something. But I do think, there comes a limit when you find just so many pieces of corresponding evidence and often find it from completely different sources that you have to wonder at a certain point, like, can this really be a coincidence anymore? And very often, it just, you reach a certain magnitude where it can't be anymore. And I think we have done that at this point with the whole White Eagle network. There are so many different investigative approaches that we've taken that have ultimately led us back to the same exact place. All the work that you've done for years about these, underground, Christian identity type groups and these, occult groups, and then finding this dossier and me finding this dossier in the course of the John Benet Ramsey research, then you and your research partner finding that the White Eagle is a term that was used by the SOSJ, and then also finding this whole incident in Ohio with biowarfare that corroborates the very obscure and specific detail of the dossier after the fact. And I think that we
Also,
are
the
very
fact
much
too,
on.
you've got Levitt and Mankind Research Unlimited, and it did have connections to the SOSJ via Cleve Baxter. And I should also point out, we also have documents in our possession, not from the McDonald collection, but from one of the other collections of SOSJ documents Keith and I have gone into, where there is correspondence with Ezra Taft Benson, who was a very prominent figure in the Mormon Church, in which they are discussing an alliance with the LDS. So,
Who was a John Birch Society member? But well, no, it wasn't.
yeah,
Taft.
Taft Benson. Yeah, he was. I'm pretty sure he was in. He was definitely into that whole kind of anti-communist network.
It was either him or his son. I can't remember, but I will say that, of course, Lawrence McDonald was a founding member of the
Council for National Policy. Yeah.
Yes, of course, I have to mention that, and I had to, and I had to mention too that he was a brief president of the John Birch Society.
And John, we got to point out something else too when we're putting together all these SOSJ connections. Thomas Schoenberger, Richard Allen Miller's buddy. Richard Allen Miller, of course, was in MMRU with his wife, Iona Miller, ex-wife Iona Miller, who was also a really close friend of Thomas Schoenberger. Thomas Schoenberger had that buddy of his, Nazar Kazemi. Is that how it's called?
Yes, Nazar Kazemi, yes.
Kazemi, yes. The godfather of his son, allegedly, who Wolfgang Schoenberger apparently got, $50,000 for turning 18 years old from Kazemi. Yeah. So Nazimir Kazemi is a member of the Sovereign Order of St. John, one of the modern incarnations of it, based out of Florida, and potentially the same one tied in with Rick Joyner and General William J. Boykin.
The Florida Priory, who, by the way, was taken to court by the Knights of Malta, and the Knights of Malta lost, that the Florida Priory was able to prove that they are part of the Knights of Malta.
So yeah, folks, I mean, this is still unfolding into this very day. You still are seeing this strange milieu of these, chivalric orders and what have you, and these just really weird, kooky, woo-woo, occult, new agey UFO type stuff. And some of this, insane white supremacist underground stuff and a lot of other factors. Obviously, you've got the whole pedophilia thing, and lots of strange intrigues abound. Well, George, John, anything else you guys want to add before we wrap up here?
That's all I can think of, brother.
George?
Yeah, I think you summed it up about as well as anyone could. It's a big mess, but it ultimately comes back to the same sort of activity and the same patterns.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, I suppose we will sign off for now. As always, I got to thank you guys for listening. Hopefully you guys will enjoy this show as much as we did having it here. And on that note, good night and good luck to you all.